So firstly, I led the first national review that the panel conducted, along with my colleagues Karen and Mark. And you'll know that that was published in March, and it was into the criminal exploitation and safeguarding issues. I'm really not going to go through too much of the report, because I know many of you, in fact most of you, will have read it, and we've already started to see reference to the report and its recommendations in some of the rapid reviews that have come in post-March. So really pleased about that. But I did want to take the opportunity just to highlight some of the key findings from the report, just as a sort of a quick reminder to you, and it might also prompt some questions. So really, in terms of sort of some of the key findings, the known risk factors around vulnerability don't always act as predictors, and that's the fact that these group of children who are subject to this criminal exploitation aren't your usual suspects. Only 2 of our group were actually known to social services, the rest weren't. Another big issue just to remind people about was about the impact of moving children away from the local area. That we found effective in the short term. However, without a wraparound, without a good wraparound, it doesn't protect in the long term, because families will creep back to the areas, and we found cases of families going back to the areas and unfortunately the young person then actually being killed. Also in terms of exclusion from mainstream schools, and again, we're not saying that exclusion causes criminal exploitation, but what we are saying is that exclusion does escalate the risk and of manipulation by criminal networks. And so it's really important to think, when it gets to that point where it is absolutely essential to exclude a young person from school, that to think about the wraparound support that they will get out of that protective environment. And then also just to highlight the importance of relationship-based practice, building trusted relationships, and trying to ensure that you make the most of reachable moments, such as points of arrest, school exclusion, physical injury, because we found that that point where you can reach that child is really important, and a lot of these children are really hard to reach, hard to meet, hard to reach to. So as we said, and I really want to highlight, really more than the sort of the report itself, which, as I said, you've all probably read by now, really just to draw your attention to the fact that through the review, we identified a series of questions and challenges in 4 key areas that we think partnerships should be working on and be able to answer. And we would really recommend that safeguarding partners look at their practice against the challenges that are set out in the review, and think about how patterns of exploitation may be shifting as a consequence of COVID. That's what I want to say sort of about the contents of the review. Now, in terms of some questions, I know there were also some questions in the forum which were posted about what's happened since the review. So in terms of cases since the review, we've continued to see a kind of constant stream of exploitation cases. In the 15 months since the review concluded, we saw a further 26 cases, similar breakdown in terms of who was involved. 25 of 26 were boys, majority were BAME. We haven't seen any kind of upsurge in criminal exploitation cases since the lockdown, but as Karen said, we are just keeping sight of what's happening and trying not to draw any conclusions before we've got the full picture. And in terms of the recommendations themselves and the response to them, We have already received a really a response from the Secretary of State welcoming the recommendations, and since that we've also been working across government with Home Office, Health, Education, Ministry of Justice, on how best to take forward the recommendations. So it's a really exciting time, and we're really looking forward to seeing some of these recommendations taken forward. I mean, just yesterday I was at speaking at a round table about the national referral mechanism.
Our second review that we've recently published has been on sudden unexpected death in infancy. Those of you who are familiar with serious case reviews and safeguarding practice reviews, indeed those who have read the triennial reviews and so on, will be aware that there are two peaks in the incident of serious and fatal child maltreatment, one in infancy and the other in adolescence. And so it's not too surprising that our first two reviews have looked at these two different age groups. And our second review looked at sudden unexpected death in infancy. And this is a slightly unusual one because, of course, we're not here dealing with deliberate abuse or neglect of a child, but we are dealing with situations where parental care, perhaps background neglect issues and so on, may be a contributory factor to some of these deaths. And it was one of the largest single groups of cases that we're seeing coming through in notifications and the rapid reviews. So we felt it would be really important to do this. We know that sudden infant death syndrome, the rates have fallen dramatically since the 1980s, and yet there's this very troublesome group where, in spite of all the advice about safer sleeping and so on, it seems that parents, for whatever reason, are either unable or unwilling to follow this advice, and these babies die in what we recognize are unsafe sleeping environments. So we looked at sudden unexpected death in infancy in families where children are recognized to be at risk of significant harm from abuse or neglect. And we looked in depth at a number of cases from across the country, combined this with an international literature review, and so we're able to identify quite a number of sort of really pertinent points. And I think the key things that I would really want to draw out from this, first, that we recognize the complexity of these families' lives, that often we're dealing with families where there are large contexts of background vulnerability and risk. And you'll see, hopefully you'll be able to see enough detail on the diagram on the right-hand side, where we've adapted the pathways to harm and pathways to protection model to look specifically at this issue of sudden unexpected death in infancy. And you'll notice that often these deaths are happening in families where there is that background context of underlying vulnerability. And then we notice that very often there are particular vulnerabilities, either in the infant, the child, or particularly in the family and the parents. A new partner comes into the family, there's background domestic violence, things like that. And then what often happens on the night in question is that there are out of routine circumstances. Something is different, so that the baby, for example, is placed to sleep in the parental bed, or the parent falls asleep on a sofa having had some alcohol or drugs, or a whole range of different things. And that's what triggers the sudden unexpected death in infancy. So recognizing this, we can recognize that pregnancy itself is quite a reachable moment, that we have the opportunity to engage with pregnant mothers, with their partners, but we need to take these opportunities, and we need to be much more flexible in our approach to these families. It's no good just using the routine lullaby trust leaflets and just giving that out and thinking that it will make a difference. We need to work on a relationship model of practice, engage with these families, and recognizing, if we can go to the next slide, recognizing that this is an issue not just for midwives and health visitors, but it is a public health issue that crosses across all practice. So social workers, police officers, housing officers, probation officers, we all have opportunities to build up those relationships, to reinforce the messages about safer sleeping, to be listening to families about the stresses that they're under and how they are coping with those, so that we can perhaps be a bit more flexible, tailored, relationship-based in the way we come in and support them. So out of this, we've come out with 3 national recommendations. We've suggested 2 areas where we feel there's a need for further research. But if you go and have a look at the published report, you'll see those. And also within that, a number of questions that we're putting to local safeguarding partnerships to ask yourselves about what's going on in our area, how can we improve practice, make it more appropriate to tackling this issue alongside all the other issues. So we're not saying, look, this has got to take priority, but it's something that gets built into our overall strategies for tackling neglect, for tackling background abuse, and so on. So that in a nutshell is the review on sudden unexpected death in infancy. Again, we'll have an opportunity to address some of the questions that people have been putting in, and I'll come back to that in our panel discussion shortly.
Morning, everybody. Mark Gurry, as Karen said, I'm the social work member of the panel and leading the 3rd national review, which was formally launched in July this year. And that's a focus on non-accidental injury in babies under 1. As Karen said earlier, it's one of the major case forms which comes our way, and it's likely that we'll need to do other reviews into this group because it's such a significant factor. But this one, and as you see, we've had nearly 200 reviews on babies, young children harmed or killed since we started in June 18. But this particular review is going to focus on men from 2 kind of perspectives. One, and colleagues across the country will be aware that very often in reviews, men are talked about as being invisible, hidden, unassessed, unengaged in child protection planning. And we need to kind of try and understand that some more. As at the same time, as we know, they are often the perpetrators of the harm in the first place. So that kind of tension between the causes of the harm and their unengagement in the safeguarding process is really the focus for this review. And in particular, we want to kind of drill down into the backgrounds, motivation, psychology of those men. One of the things that this review is designed to do is to look in detail at the abuse itself. So whilst all reviews will look at the functioning of the safeguarding system, they will look at the kind of background risk factors that were pertinent at the time of the incident. What they don't always do is look in detail at the actual circumstances of the abuse. And that's one of the things this review will be majoring on. We've appointed 3 fieldwork reviewers, and they are already making contact, and some of you may be in this list, with a number 20, 25 cases that have come across our desk since over the last year or so, which we think will help illuminate these issues. And they're making contact with you and conducting some interviews with practitioners and family members in your area. We've also appointed a clinical psychologist to work with us, and we're asking him to help us in the construction of and the analysis of interviews with the men themselves. Most of these, or all of them, are now currently in prison, so we are working through the Ministry of Justice and the Prison Service to construct some interviews with them, where we will want to, as I said, want to explore their backgrounds, their motivation, their psychology, but really try and understand what was happening in the moment of the abuse. And there was a question just about how cases get selected. So just to pick that up, we are dependent on the work that comes our way. So when we have decided on a thematic review, as we have here, we will look at the number of cases which fall within that theme, and from that identify those cases which we think will best illuminate and illustrate some of the issues we want to explore. We've also got a literature review underway. The Fatherhood Institute is conducting that for us. And two final things. We are looking still, and this is a call to all of you, we're looking still for any evidence, any reviews, any thematic work that you have done that might help illustrate this area of work. And if you have done that, please contact us or simply send us the report. And secondly, we're looking for people who have already kind of thought about this and begun to get into some different practice and different service construction, particularly to better engage men. And because one of the things we'll want to do, as we did in the criminal exploitation review, is to examine areas of good or emerging good practice. So please do let us know about that. The review at some point will consist of some roundtable discussions where we'll start to share some of the findings we've gathered, and we'll want to test that against some of the practice that you can tell us about. So I think that's it for now. The review's just kicked off, so we're hoping it will be finalised come March of next year.